Hi everyone, and welcome to the studio session, Lessons from and for Science Diplomacy. Never before has the fast and trustworthy transfer of knowledge between countries been so critical as it has during the COVID-19 pandemic. This panel will explore how countries mobilize diplomacy, the challenges they faced, and the lessons they learned. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce the moderator of this panel, María Jarquín, Deputy Director of the International Affairs at the University of Costa Rica. She's a political scientist and an expert in science diplomacy. The panelists for this session are Marga Soler, young global leader of the World Economic Forum and the founder of SciDipGLOBAL, Jan Marco Mueller, Science and Technology Advisor in the European External Action Service, Mitsunobu Kano, Science and Technology Co-Advisor for the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan, and Mandë Holford, Associate Professor at the Hunter College of the City University of New York.
Thank you, Marie-Pierre, and welcome everyone to this INGSA2021 International Conference on Science Advice to Governments. Build Back Wiser, Knowledge, Policy, and Publics in Dialogue. As Marie-Pierre just mentioned, this is the studio session, and we will have a fantastic conversation, and we will reflect about the lessons from and for science diplomacy. This is day one of the conference, and we will be reflecting what the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed about evidence-informed advising globally. In addition, this will be a 4-day event of future-focused agenda-setting debate from the forefront of science advice and science diplomacy. INGSA is a collaborative platform for policy exchange, capacity building, and research across diverse global science advisory organizations and national systems. Do visit and follow INGSA's website and social media on Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube for more events and information. So today we will have a great opportunity to reflect about what happened in the science diplomacy sphere during the pandemic. Science diplomacy promotes actions designed to address global challenges like a pandemic, country needs, and build cross-border agreements through science, technology, and innovation. But what have we learned about science diplomacy in a COVID-19 scenario? What worked and why? Interactions between science and diplomacy are not recent. Historically, the world has seen amazing collaborations between the scientific and the diplomatic spheres to achieve major human development achievements. However, the pandemic might seem like a breaking point for science diplomacy. More and more countries and government officials are referring to it. The research agenda has expanded from a diversity of academic areas. And without a doubt, science, technology, and innovation is increasingly gaining in importance on the foreign policy agenda of countries worldwide. For example, diplomatic corps had to start working hand in hand with public health experts in order to respond to the spread of the virus, in order to accelerate the production, purchase, and distribution of vaccines worldwide. In this context, where new structures created and will they endure? Were the ideals of science diplomacy met, or were they compromised under crisis? And has thinking about science diplomacy changed as a result of the pandemic? We will be answering those questions with our fantastic panels, and I am honored to introduce you, to greet you. You are panelists, you are thinkers and practitioners at the interface of science and diplomacy. So welcome, and thank you for being with us today. So let's start our conversation. I would like to ask my first question, and it is related to how the COVID-19 pandemic changed the science diplomacy agenda in your countries, regions, and worldwide. Dr. Gual, let's start with you. You have seen the rise of science diplomacy agenda in different countries for the last years. what has been different in the last 1.5 year and in terms of discourses, in terms of networks creation?
Sorry, I missed your last question. You got frozen. Can you repeat, Maria?
Of course. Sorry. Yes, no, I was just asking you, you have seen the rise of science diplomacy agenda in different countries. So what has been different from your point of view in the last year in terms of discourses, in terms of network creation around science diplomacy?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me, and congratulations to INGSA for another very important conference at a very important time. And thank you, Maria, for moderating us and bringing us together with my fantastic fellow panelists. So for those of us in science diplomacy for a long time, we have to remember that this vocabulary of science diplomacy, we only have it for about 10 years, right? And we have seen the explosion of the concept of the vocabulary during the past year and a half because of COVID-19. And in a way, we can say that science diplomacy has entered the mainstream. We have seen it used in the media, we have seen it used by governments, by scientific institutions, by multilateral organizations. So it is now a mainstream topic. And I think that comes with positive and negative aspects. And I would love to discuss those. But it is, as you were saying, without doubt, we have seen this momentum grow for science diplomacy in all fronts, the academic policy, both in the national government level, also subnational government, supranational institutions, multilateral organizations, and so forth. So both in the practice, the research side, and also education and training. And I hope we have some time to talk about this as well, also with my dear friend Mandë. And so, as you were saying, we have seen the need, almost scrambling this new ecosystem of foreign policymakers, of diplomats, ambassadors, embassies, missions, scrambling to deal with a very new and unexpected agent and sometimes enemy, we can characterize it, that really needs very technical and complex knowledge in order to be able to address it and tackle it. And we have not always seen the expertise being available and readily available to inform and to act rapidly to help those policymakers and diplomatic ecosystems act fast. And so that's one dimension of it, right? The lack of expertise, not that the expertise doesn't exist, but the lack of connection, of boundary spanning platforms and interfaces to make it readily available. But this cannot be disconnected from the politics, right? And from the geopolitics. So COVID-19 arrived at a moment of a kind of a low point for multilateralism, we could say. We had seen some fragmentation in terms of international agreements in other type of global challenges like climate change and certain countries withdrawing from that commitment to multilateral action. And that for sure impacted the way the world was able or not to come together quickly to find the solution for this problem. And here we can then also separate what the actions of the scientific community have been from the actions of the political and diplomatic spheres, right? So we saw how quickly scientists from China, from the US, from all countries came together to sequence the virus, to post it online, open access, and that enabled very quickly for a vaccine to be developed, to be produced, and to be available for the world. But of course, science is not enough, right? The diplomatic envelope that surrounds that scientific advancement, in a way we have a historic, unprecedented discovery or application of a new technology, for instance, the mRNA vaccines, it is not enough to have the science and to be quick on that front. You also need the diplomatic envelope to be able to support the solution to be deployed. And I would love to talk about the issues around vaccine diplomacy, vaccine equity, and I'm sure my colleagues will arrive to that to that topic. And so in general, I would say that COVID-19, for many of us, we have seen it as a life case study. And of course, this is not to minimize the tragedy, right? So it's not an academic exercise, it's a very real world exercise. It's a very real world challenge, it's not an academic exercise, but that has provided validation and also a myriad of new questions that were perhaps before more abstract. Like when we used to say in the community, the INGSA community, that science does not dictate policy, that science provides options for the policymakers and decision makers to take or not. So now we have seen how complex those decisions are when you have to weigh and balance the economic, the social, the scientific, the epidemiological factors. And you can see how science alone, again, is not enough to dictate and to decide a course of action. Another thing that really caught my attention is how many countries, especially in the global north, they had very robust science advice and science diplomacy mechanism in place. And some of them have long traditions of science advice and science diplomacy, but that doesn't mean they were used when they were most needed. And that has to do with leadership deciding that they want to make use or not of those mechanisms. And finally, on the academic front, we have also seen a lot of a very rich debate, a number of special issues in academic journals like the AAAS Science and Diplomacy, which Mandë and I were co-editors of it, Frontier. So a number of academic outlets have really put their focus on science diplomacy. And just to speak on the two regions that we work more closely right now in SciDipGLOBAL, which are Europe and Latin America, I'm very pleased to see, especially in both regions actually, you know that there were very active research projects around science diplomacy, Horizon 2020 projects that they are ending or ended, and now they have formed the actors that were the consortia that were part of those research projects in science diplomacy have now created the European Science Diplomacy Alliance. So hopefully that really provides a long-term sustainable platform for science diplomacy, as you were saying, and the question was very pertinent about how many of these structures are going to endure or are going to be just for the moment, right, until COVID not goes away, but the crisis mode has passed. In Latin America, we have also very promising advancements. Countries like Colombia, now they're creating a national science diplomacy strategy. Costa Rica, and with you, Maria, there's a big focus from the university, from the foreign ministry. New science diplomacy strategies are emerging at the regional level. UNESCO, for instance, we're working with them on science diplomacy capacity building in Central America, Latin America. So we're seeing a lot of action, top down and bottom up, national, subnational, and supranational. And finally, I will say one trend that I'm seeing moving forward, and this one is in Europe, in Switzerland, is the concept of anticipating what diplomatic envelopes are going to be needed for future challenges in a way that we can be more proactive and less reactive, like we have seen with COVID-19, that a lot of us, a lot of people say, oh, we got caught by surprise by it. And of course, the scientists and the epidemiologists have been warning about it, but why we're not ready? Those are the questions that we will unpack in this conference. There's a lot to talk about, but I will stop here and hopefully we can unpack a little bit more of these items. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gual. This gives us lots of insights to continue the conversation, and I would like to address to Dr. Mueller. You have been working very closely with diplomatic corps during the last year. What new structure has been created, and what work and why?
Yes, thank you, Maria. And I think, first of all, let's recall actually that COVID-19 has had a profound impact on diplomacy. There are, of course, all the geopolitical questions that have arisen. So think of vaccine diplomacy and vaccine nationalism, which is closely linked to the vaccine equity issues Marga was mentioning, the search for SARS-CoV-2 origins, the future of WHO. There's a whole range of questions that has appeared on the political agenda due to COVID-19, also in the foreign relations sector. But at the same time, also let's not forget that COVID-19 has impacted diplomacy as such, you know, with diplomats not being able to reach or leave their duty stations, with diplomats not having access to vaccines or not having access to vaccines recognized in their home countries. And of course, as we also can see in this conference right now, obviously COVID-19 has deprived diplomacy of one of its most important tools, and that's face-to-face meetings. And I think what it has done is really also to have sharpened the awareness of diplomats for the importance of science and technology. Yeah, it's when you want to manage a pandemic, it's not enough just to talk to foreign and security policy think tanks, which are kind of traditional sources of information for diplomatic services. But actually, you need to engage with a whole bunch of scientific disciplines, with epidemiology. You need to deal with institutions like science academies, etc. And that's kind of not traditional business of diplomats, so to speak. So I think that's certainly one change we have seen, that we have seen this awareness now that actually we need to engage much larger with science and technology in many aspects, in many ways. And when I talk about the European External Action Service as such, my own position, it was created on the 1st of August 2020, so kind of midway in the pandemic. And it's quite interesting, actually, the agreement to have such a position was already done before the pandemic, but it had a narrow focus, because I'm seconded from the European Commission's Joint Research Center. And the initial idea was, to have a liaison between JRC, which is the scientific evidence service of the European Commission, and the European External Action Service. But actually it developed into a fully fledged science and technology advisor position. And this is, of course, very important, because it has become very quickly a point of reference for everything around science and technology, not just COVID-19, where I'm advising, of course, on political issues, but also on the very practical issues and questions that come from our delegations around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mueller. Interesting point that you raised. And actually, now I would like to ask Dr. Holford, you're a marine chemical biologist, and you have been advancing the science diplomacy and the science education agenda for the last year. What has changed in the last, with the pandemic? In your experience, what has been different for you in advancing these agendas in the last year and a half?
So I first want to thank you, Maria, for serving as our moderator, and also INGSA for the invitation to be here. And I'm happy to meet some of my colleagues. Marga, of course, is a close dear friend, but the others are new. So thank you guys for the opportunity to meet here. And as Gianmarco said, I mean, the greatest thing that COVID has robbed science diplomacy of is the face-to-face diplomacy of meeting and greeting, and the very real cultural connection that needs to happen for diplomacy to take place. With my own work, what worked and why? So what worked, I think, was the science. Quite clearly, we know that the science worked because the scientists were able to mobilize very quickly, lean on existing infrastructures, lean on existing collaborations, and create new ones, like we saw with rapid publications in the field, rapid mechanisms for funding new ideas and new things. Those were new structures that I hope stay, because now you have different ways of publishing that are peer reviewed, that aren't hidden behind a paywall, all these kinds of things that I hope remain as we move forward. And as you said, in my field of chemical biology, marine chemical biology, we know that, the oceans touches all of us. And in a similar way, COVID-19 has touched every single one of us. And in large part, what's happened now is that I think, as Gianmarco said so eloquently, all of the diplomatic agencies have realized that there's some part of science and technology that they need to be engaging in a day-to-day basis. And I think what happened is, for training the next generation of science diplomats, what happened is similar to something that happened with the space race. So, you know, it's not a time when I was there, but there was a big space race that happened between the US and Russia that led for the US a rise in STEM education and a rise in how we train and teach science. And I think something very similar has happened with COVID. I'm calling it the COVID constellation. You know how constellations are how people tell stories and beliefs and relate to each other. The next generation of scientists this past year and a half has been instrumental in shaping the kind of science they want to do and the vision of what science is and how it can add to diplomatic efforts. And so what they've seen is that science is a global good. What they've seen is that science can be used as an entity to support, enhance, and advance society. What they've seen is that science can also be ignored. Even the strongest evidence can be ignored. And so what that means to them is we have to find multiple ways in which we can communicate our science. And so in terms of science diplomacy, I think for the next generation, what they're finding out is I have to figure out how to do my science in a way that's global. And I have to build my global network so that I can get out the evidence of what I've produced in the lab without the paywalls, without the gatekeepers, without the people that might prevent that from getting out, in a way to combat misinformation, right? So going straight to the source. And to do that, they're building new networks amongst themselves, constellations. They've decided that this is how I'm going to do my science. This is how I want to share my science. This is how I want my science to benefit society. And I think that's been one of the things that I've noticed in the work that I do to train next generation science diplomats, is that they have a clear vision sort of what they want science to do and how they want science to be perceived by society, by politicians, by diplomats. And while they might not have the pathway or an exact, roadmap to how to get there, they're aware of the questions and the power of what science can do.
Thank you, Dr. Holford, for giving us an insight of your own work and of course, the insights for the next science diplomacy generation. Now, let's go to Japan with Dr. Kano. Can you share a bit about your own experience on how the science diplomacy agenda was impacted in the last year?
Sure. Thank you so much, Maria, for your kind chairing of this session. And as Gianmarco mentioned, we lose the chances of face-to-face meeting, but still having this kind of new technology realize us to meet virtually like this from everywhere in the world. It's a nice thing. So this pandemic has reminded us that global issues of this kind of zoonotic diseases, including COVID-19 pandemic, cannot be resolved by just one country, and international cooperation is really essential. Although we have had to experience this kind of things through events like SARS or avian influenza, this pandemic has revealed that still our society, our international society, is not still yet prepared much or enough, and also we are still vulnerable. So from this point of view, of course, we needed to still emphasize the meaning of the science and technology diplomacy. But still, we did have some examples that we have been successful to some extent about these kind of activities, we are sure. Let me share you two examples. One is about the development of new science and technology, which is not only the medical side. I'm actually from the clinical medicine before, and therefore I know that, of course, development of drugs or vaccines are really important. But still, we are all humans, not needing only drugs or vaccines, but we live with a lot of technology surrounding us, not only from medical side. And therefore, development of some technologies or sciences related to non-medical field would be very important. And some of Japanese funding agencies like JST or IMET are now supporting international research development in terms of that non-medical field researchers. So that's one point. And another point would be the vaccine diplomacy, so-called. We, of course, still have a lot of issues in the supply of vaccination to the larger areas in the world. But still, we have, for example, ACT accelerator or COVAX facility, which are really crucial to establish the equitable distribution of vaccines in the world. And Japan has strongly supported this kind of activities, the COVAX facility, through financing and co-hosting the summit. And during the G7 summit in June this year, further commitment to COVAX was reaffirmed by the member states. Accelerating efforts are needed, including the provision of cold chain equipment, which is also Japanese government has been making effort, which is called as last 1 mile support, which is providing the equipment to realize the delivery of vaccines down to each and every person by leveraging relevant technology, including the refrigerator providing, and so on. And lastly, in my personal view, it will be very important to think about how we can anticipate the potential dangers of human beings, to think about what could be the next step for the science and technology diplomacy would be need to do. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Kano. It adds lots of value to our discussion, because now I would like to reflect on the intersection of science diplomacy and science communication in the last year and a half. Dr. Mueller, how has been your advisory experience of communicating data, risk, and uncertainty to decision makers who will have an impact on the international relations of a region like the European Union? You have been really close to the European vaccine diplomacy. Can you tell us about that experience, sharing example and reflecting about what worked and why?
Well, actually, as I told you, I started in my job on the 1st of August, 2020. And I was thinking, when you start in a new job, when you're actually the first one in the job, then you think, okay, where should I start? And 10 days after my start, Mr. Putin came to my rescue, so to speak, when he announced the approval of Sputnik V as the first COVID-19 vaccine, actually before even entering phase 3 clinical trials. I said, okay, that's it. And the best thing I can do is to inform the fellow diplomats actually what kind of vaccines are in the pipeline, are being developed, what are the differences. How are actually vaccines being approved, and what is this whole story about clinical trials about? But also what I also tried always to do already then is to think a little bit of the geopolitical implications. So what if we have an asynchronous rollout of vaccines from different parts of the world in different parts of the world? And so I always thought a little bit a step further and trying to make the information or the data tangible for the diplomats. So I'm not doing the political analysis, that's what others are doing, but I'm kind of pointing to the issues. And of course, following this first note, there were many other notes around the mutations and the variants. And you know, as the pandemic developed, I was informing my colleagues. But then, of course, there was also the external communication dimension coming in. We were seeing disinformation campaigns, for instance, against Western vaccines, so to speak. And we need to kind of counter these with arguments, of course, also with scientific arguments. We had questions coming from our own delegations. Yeah, we will remember all the discussions around the AstraZeneca vaccines early in the rollout of the vaccines, and the issue around the blood clots and the secondary effects and so on. And then we are getting messages from our delegations in Africa, because the COVAX mechanism, as Dr. Kano mentioned, they the COVAX was delivering to Africa the Covishield, which is the Indian version of the AstraZeneca. And then there were questions, okay, if the Europeans don't take AstraZeneca, why should we get it? And then we got to all this narrative of kind of first and second class vaccines, so to speak, and which is actually still ongoing to a certain extent. And where it is very important to inform with scientific arguments. So what I was doing is to inform our own external communications department a little bit, giving them arguments they can use when they're dealing with the public. And then also what then it developed into was actually a vaccine strategy task force, which we set up internally in the European External Action Service, where I'm kind of the voice of science, so to speak. And what we do now is actually to inform our member states and to communicate with member states how is the situation in different countries of the world. So we are not telling the EU member states, you should give vaccines to country X or country Y, because that's at the end they need to decide. It's their vaccines, and they will all have their political priorities. But we can provide them with all the data and all the information, how the vaccine rollout is going in different parts of the world. So it is very important, actually, indeed, this science communication aspect, but it's both an internal aspect with our own diplomats, with our own communications people, with our own delegations, but also, of course, the external aspect. And here, of course, the scientific information is key. But again, it doesn't work if you just present it in isolation. Here's the data, take it. But you also need to put it always into this kind of geopolitical context to make it actually usable for the diplomats.
Thank you, Dr. Müller, for your insightful examples and comments. And on that note, I would like to ask Dr. Gual, let's reflect about what the pandemic has revealed about evidence-informed advising globally. Can you share with us global or maybe national examples that you know where the ideals of science diplomacy were met or were compromised during this time?
Yes, and I would like to stop here for maybe a little bit of a provocation, because when we talk about the ideals of science diplomacy, the reality is that we don't yet have an agreement on what those ideals are. And this is a very heated debate right now from the academic side of science diplomacy. And I see it between the practitioners and the academics, and sometimes it's really hard to make sense of both worlds, right? But and you, Maria, you are also an academic of science diplomacy, and you know this, because traditionally, the scientific view of science diplomacy, meaning from the scientific community perspective, has been this universal view of science as a global good, and science cooperation, and basically scientists being these individuals that work for the greater good, and science for solidarity and peace and all of that. But this view has been challenged in the last few years, especially from the academic consortium, the European consortiums that I was talking about, and there's now a big push from some of these academic lines and schools of thought, let's say, from different disciplines to challenge that idea. And I would love for my fellow panelists to comment on this, because of course, science diplomacy has also a competitive side, right? So the collaborative versus competitive dimension of science diplomacy, those sides, those dimensions coexist. So can we talk about an ideal that's already an established ideal of science diplomacy, or do we have these two or more dimensions that coexist? And for example, and I think we talked about this already, the scientists being quick to collaborate in this kind of universal goal of ending the pandemic and doing the best, no matter where they're from, contributing to this global scientific enterprise. And then the vaccine nationalism and the vaccine diplomacy, big interest. It means you are working with others, but at the end, you want to advance and strengthen your interests. So vaccine diplomacy, as my colleague from Japan has said, many of those vaccine diplomacy efforts come with strings attached. They come with conditions, with, they support foreign policy and geopolitical goals, and those donations and sharing of vaccines has come with the request for something in exchange. And so we can also see, which is quite interesting to me, the names, and sometimes those details really show how the trends and where science diplomacy in terms of COVID is really going, and how it manifests. For instance, in the names the vaccines have been given, like Sputnik, Soberana, in Cuba, Patria in Mexico, right? Those words mean this is about our national pride. We want our national vaccine. How important is for us to be able to say that we have our national vaccine and we have the scientific capacity to make a vaccine that doesn't depend on the others. So now this is a larger trend that really speaks to this, concepts of technology sovereignty, right? And how can you be self-sufficient? And even in the EU, there's also this conversation. So it's not just in the context of a kind of a new tech war between the US and China, which was the original, the origins of the narrative, but now it really is everywhere. So how do you achieve that technology sovereignty, even technology supremacy, to be able to provide know-how without depending on the others? And that is in contrast to the nature of the threat. So sometimes those issues are treated like military, kind of traditional geopolitical issues. But this is no longer the world that we're in, right? With viruses, with climate change, with all these transnational threats. We really need that global collaboration, because those challenges do not respond to military tactics, to hard power, to tanks, and all of the traditional military and foreign policy instruments. And so this is me putting the question to my fellow panelists. How do you see this kind of technology sovereignty and nationalism in a kind of a zero-sum game, in the face of the nature of the threats, which is clearly transnational and global?
Thank you, Dr. Gual. Yes, I would like to hear the opinion of Dr. Holford on these insightful comments that Marga just did.
I absolutely want to comment, because in many ways, I think I agree that what COVID has done is it sort of brought to the forefront and challenged the ideals of science diplomacy, right? And so what ideals were met? They were met when we were identifying the problem, as you said, with collaboration. Scientists quickly sequenced the virus, were able to share that information. They were met when we were trying to fund the solution, because industry, IP issues were put aside for a while. Industry and academia and government were all working collaboratively to fund the problem. Money was not an object at this point, right? So where there was a will, there was a way in terms of finances. And then where it fell apart was when we came to dissemination. And that's where you're talking about, the technology nationalism and everyone wanting to have their own vaccine and not trusting other vaccines, or having made a vaccine, deciding first we have to cover our people before we will cover anybody else. And, it's like anyone has to get covered by the wayside. And I think how this will change science diplomacy is that it will take it away from, as you were saying, the idealism of science diplomacy, that it's this public good, which it is, and how it's seen and how it's taught, to the practical instrumentation and dissemination of science diplomacy. And I think with that shift comes the idea that we're going away from development and assistance, and we're going towards capacity building and independence. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing because it challenges who gets to do science and how science is done. Like, for example, I was telling my colleagues about Dr. Happy, who is a Cameroon scientist working in Nigeria at the African Center of Excellence for Genomics of Infectious Diseases. He and his colleagues had developed a vaccine. In the early stages, they were the first to sort of sequence the strain that's found in sub-Saharan Africa. And he himself has been trained in Harvard and has helped to mitigate Ebola spreading throughout all of West Africa. So he's a very talented and respected scientist in his field. But he cannot raise funds either on the continent of Africa or outside of Africa to develop the vaccine that they've made, which they think is about 90% effective, simply because of this issue, I think, of who gets to do science, right? So the idea science is something that's very good and we're going to bring it to you and share it, as opposed to you can also participate in making the science. And so as we know, if most countries are able to set up their own facilities for making and disseminating the vaccine, we would have better spread throughout the world in terms of the amount of population vaccinated and the amount of people. And it might even decrease a little bit of the miscommunication or disinformation that's going around, as Marco was pointing out earlier about the vaccine. If people feel that the vaccine was made in-house and by their people and for their people, then we might be able to stem some of that miscommunication. So I think what's happened is that science diplomacy has been put to the test. So, trial by fire, sort of, by COVID-19. And so some of it stood up really well. The idea that, yes, science is something that is practiced and built on the shoulders of giants, right? We all have to trust the information and share the information in order for it to advance and make leapfrog kind of innovations. But when we combine that now, because these are two very big fields coming together, right? Science and diplomacy. When we combine that with the dissemination, which requires the diplomacy, which requires, the public outreach, which requires things that the scientists can't control, is where there's sort of a breakdown and where I feel the infrastructure was not ready or built. And I think this is where we're going to see the shift from the development and assistance in science diplomacy to the practical and independence in nation building in science diplomacy.
Thank you, Dr. Holford and Dr. Gual, for this amazing reflection regarding how science diplomacy, how science has been challenged. And in that topic, let's discuss a bit about the future of science diplomacy. Dr. Kano, you have had an impressive role at the Global Young Academy. Can you please share your insights about the future of science diplomacy and maybe share a message for the younger generations for science diplomacy?
Okay, thank you so much. I have been a member of the Global Young Academy, as Maria kindly introduced, and also I have been executive committee member in that organization before. One active outcome of this pandemic of utilization of science and technology diplomacy is about more active discussion on how we can deal with the next, not expected, but not want to have, but next potential pandemic. One example would be a discussion from WHO, which is resulted in the resolution of the strengthening WHO preparedness for and response to health emergencies. And the other would be G7 Caribbean Bay Health Declaration, where people declared that we wish to have a active method to deal with that pandemic within 100 days of finding the danger. Although that would be a bit too challenging personally, but these kind of discussion in the future should have involving wider generation, in my view. That would be possible because the views from the various generation would be a bit, wider in terms of what we experienced in our younger ages. Maybe the point of view of human beings would be formed based on our younger generation experiences, and therefore the point of view from various generations would be varied. But we all share this society, and therefore having wider range of generations is really important in quite personally, I think. And from this point of view, I really wish to encourage younger people to be involved in input their own views into the discussions we need to have in not only in the science diplomacy, but also in science advice. This is my personal view. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Kano. And we are now in the last 5 minutes of this conversation. Can you share in 1 minute, what is the future of science diplomacy for you? Who are the key actors, policy sectors, networks, research agenda? Dr. Holford, let's start with you. You have 1 minute.
Thank you very much. So I think the future, and it's interesting for me, given my field, I work with snails that eat fish. And so I study venomous marine snails. So right now we're also at the start of the decade of the ocean. And so having COVID-19 come at the same time when we're doing decade of the ocean, there's a phrase that we're using for the decade of the ocean called the 3 Gs, right? So it's generation, geography, and gender. And so I think going forward, what COVID has done is sort of amplified all of those Gs, because it certainly has touched everyone, right, in terms of geography. In terms of gender, I think it's shown that women leaders, or the leaders who are leading in some nations, have been able initially to tackle and listen and collaborate a lot better than some others, and so have been shown to be able to rule countries in the same capacity as their male counterparts. And then in terms of generation, speaking similar to my colleague Kano, I think that's going to have the largest impact. And as I mentioned before, similar to how the space race had an impact on a generation of Americans, I think that the COVID-19 has made this COVID constellation of scientists who are the next generation who will be participating in science diplomacy. And for them, it's going to be about how do we make it more equitable? Who gets to do the science? Who is impacted by the science? And who benefits from the science, right? As we've seen, a lot of Black and brown communities around the world have been the ones that have been suffering the most because they don't have the capacity to build their own vaccines, to distribute, and to do all of the things necessary that others will. And I think coming out of it, that's going to be a key question for the next generation. Who gets to do science, and who benefits from the science, and who can produce the things that society needs?
Thank you. Dr. Mueller, your thoughts on the future for science diplomacy?
Well, I think in the past year, we have seen that the multilateral system has gone through its worst crisis since World War II. We've seen this whole surge of populist politicians, of conspiracy theories, of really all kind of very irrational behavior, actually, but also an undermining of the multilateral institutions. On the other side, we have all these global challenges, like global pandemics, like climate change, like biodiversity loss, etc., which can be tackled only by an international multilateral response. So I think it is very key that we prepare the multilateral institutions, actually reform them to make them fit to deal with these complex challenges of the 21st century. And many of the answers will be given by science and technology. So that's why it is so urgent and so important that we really develop science diplomacy into the future to deal with these multilateral challenges, and that actually we enable the multilateral system to be based on the evidence and to find the answers that we need for a sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mueller. Now let's hear Dr. Kano's closing remarks about the future of science diplomacy.
All right, thank you so much. So my last word would be, this is although personal, let's prepare for the emergency from normal time, but with society, with broader range of generations. Thanks.
Thank you. And finally, Marga.
My last word goes to really education and training. So I think we need to change the way we train future scientists, change the way we need future diplomats. The careers of the future are not going to look like the past century. And if we continue to train people in the same mold and in the same cookie cutter shape in science and in diplomacy, we're not going to be to build this interface where both communities meet. So yeah, I think we need to revamp education on all fronts, all levels, but especially how we prepare our scientists and our diplomats to go out into the world.
Thank you so much. This concludes this webinar. Science diplomacy is really at the center of what human development is: collaboration, science. It was an honor sharing this conversation with you, and I really wish you the best in the days to come. We will certainly be following your expertise and actions around science diplomacy. So thank you for being here with us today, and to the audience also. Thank you for joining the session. I'm María Jarquín, greetings from San Jose, Costa Rica, and we will go back to you, María, at Montreal.
Thank you very much, María Jarquín, and also thank you to all the panelists for this great discussion and all these precious insights. We already knew and also experimented how the pandemic changed our lives, but this panel highlighted the other profound impacts behind the scenes. Don't go too far because we will be back after a short 15 minutes break.